I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Obukhanych. Dr. Tetyana Obukhanych earned a Ph.D. in immunology at the Rockefeller University, New York, and has held postdoctoral appointments in prominent immunology laboratories affiliated with Harvard Medical School and Stanford University School of Medicine. She is founding director of Physicians for Informed Consent, a nonprofit organization of doctors and scientists dedicated to safeguarding informed consent in vaccination. She is the author of Vaccine Illusion, and she lectures frequently at conferences and educational events throughout North America, as well as at Building Bridges in Children's Health, BBCH, an online community that equips parents with the knowledge of up-to-date science relevant to children's health in order to empower them in their own communications with medical doctors. Welcome, Tetyana.
Thank you, Brella. Good afternoon. So today we will be discussing this very important question. Are we making vaccination decisions for ourselves or for our community? And we will break it down to 5 questions. And I really like your participation because I'm sure that you already know the answers to these questions. And we really need to be the course down until each of our legislators and each of our public health officials knows this too. So let's start with question 1. Are all diseases equally transmissible in a public setting? What do you think?
No.
How about chickenpox?
Yes.
Very, very transmissible, very infectious, very contagious. What is on the other spectrum of diseases that we vaccinate for that are not transmissible? Tetanus. Which one is transmissible via blood-borne products? Hep B. Okay, so let's start with Hep B because that is the first one on the schedule, on the childhood schedule. Let's see what CDC says on hepatitis B transmission. Let's see if CDC knows Tetyana. Hepatitis B is transmitted when blood, semen, or another body fluid from a person infected with the hepatitis B virus enters the body of someone who is not infected. This can happen through sexual contact, sharing needles, syringes, or other drug injection equipment, or from mother to baby at birth. Now, this vaccine is mandated for kindergartners. Is there any other way that hepatitis B can be transmitted? No. So it is possible that hepatitis B virus will be present in saliva of hepatitis B carriers. However, that saliva needs to be injected into you for you to be infected. Hepatitis B virus doesn't go through the skin. And this was actually mentioned on the public health page of Canada, that sharing a mouthpiece, a piece of musical instruments does not transmit hepatitis B virus. All right. But maybe CDC misses something, maybe we miss something, and maybe kindergartners are involved in such activities that we are not aware of that we shouldn't be doing. There is a second part of this that is very well acknowledged in mainstream medical literature, is that 15 to 50% of children who initially respond to the hepatitis B vaccine, which is given at birth, by the time they're 5 to 15 years of age, they have undetectable concentrations of antibodies from that vaccine, meaning they don't have protective titers. So we have hordes of kindergartners, vaccinated kindergartners, who no longer have protective titers. Among them, there could be a few unvaccinated, vaccine-exempt kindergartners who don't have protective titers. So there are many more vaccinated kindergartners than unvaccinated kindergartners who don't have protective titers. The question is, where is the hepatitis B epidemic in our kindergartens? So that's the question we need to ask ourselves. Let's go to the next one, and as you said correctly, it's tetanus. Again, CDC is in agreement with us on tetanus transmissibility. Tetanus is different from other vaccine-preventable diseases because it does not spread from person to person. So this is all we need to know for the purposes of our discussion today, but for more questions on tetanus, we will be holding a lecture on February 3. It will be online, and you can register for this event on BBCH website, bbch.community, and you can go to Events tab and find that event to register. Let's go to the next question. Can herd immunity be created with a toxoid vaccine? And this one will be a little bit harder because we need to know what is a toxoid. How many people know what is a toxoid? We have a few hands. All right, so let's discuss that. So toxoid is a formaldehyde inactivated bacterial toxin. There are several species of bacteria out there that produce toxins. And one is tetanus, so we heard about tetanus toxin, yes, and tetanus vaccine is a tetanus toxoid vaccine. Another one is diphtheria. So C. diphtheriae, which is the bacterial species, can come in two forms. Toxigenic form, the one that produces diphtheria toxin, and non-toxigenic form, the one that doesn't. And if you are infected with toxigenic form and diphtheria toxin starts to be produced, this is what is responsible for the symptoms of clinical diphtheria. If you're infected with non-toxigenic form, you will be just a carrier for some time of that strain, and you won't have the symptoms of clinical diphtheria. So the way that the vaccine was created back in the 1920s, or even earlier, that the toxin was isolated from bacteria. It is actually secreted. Bacteria secretes the toxin into the supernatant when they are grown, and then that toxin is being inactivated with formaldehyde. And so here you go, this is your vaccine. That is injected into you, and your immune system produces antibodies against diphtheria toxoid. These antibodies circulate in your bloodstream, and they're supposed to neutralize the effect of diphtheria toxin if you are ever exposed to toxigenic strain, to undo its effects. So the thing is, if the vaccine is directed against the toxin and not against bacteria, can it create herd immunity? Can it prevent colonization and transmission of C. diphtheriae from person to person? Theoretically, this is not possible. Do we have a confirmation of that from epidemiological literature? Yes, we do. So this was in a paper about an outbreak of diphtheria that happened in Texas in 1972. And what they found is that there was an outbreak of diphtheria in the classroom, and both vaccinated and unvaccinated children were infected with C. diphtheriae. C. diphtheriae could be cultured out of their throats at exactly the same rate. And did they lose the what? No. Okay. So the rate of colonization with C. diphtheriae was exactly the same between fully vaccinated, partially vaccinated, and unvaccinated kids in that classroom. The only difference was who developed clinical diphtheria. And unvaccinated kids who were infected developed clinical diphtheria, whereas those who were vaccinated, the majority did not develop clinical diphtheria, but a few did anyway. So vaccine is now 100% working for everyone. Based on that and other observations that existed back then, this is what the authors of this paper conclude. Diphtheria outbreaks have been described in populations with as much as 94% of the people being previously immunized. These outbreaks, the known importance of carriers in the spread of diphtheria, and the demonstrated failure of toxoid to prevent the carrier state led us to conclude that the concept of herd immunity is not applicable in the prevention of diphtheria. A high level of community immunization will not stop the transmission of diphtheria, but it will limit the numbers of cases of clinical diphtheria. So, again, are you vaccinating ourselves for diphtheria to protect someone else? No. So the next one is pertussis.
Tetyana, speaking to the microphone.
Well, she said you need to stand like right here,
Oh, right.
and that will be the, sorry guys.
So pertussis is another one which completes the DTaP vaccine or Tdap vaccine. And pertussis, Bordetella pertussis, the bacterium, also secretes a toxin, actually a number of them. One of them is pertussis toxin. And so it is a quasi-toxoid vaccine because pertussis toxoid, formaldehyde inactivated pertussis toxin, is included in this vaccine, but in addition it has some other components which are FHA, stands for filamentous hemagglutinin, pertactin, and fimbriae. So these additional ones, theoretically we could think, well, maybe they are the ones that are protecting us from being colonized by Bordetella pertussis if we are later exposed to it. But the reality turned out to be different. So we know how after the switch from the old DTP to the new DTaP, pertussis is returning. And in the beginning, when that vaccine was introduced, it wasn't tested whether it can or cannot intercept transmission. And the first time that it was tested was only in 2014, I believe, by the FDA. And this is what they wrote about it. So from the FDA's press release on the pertussis vaccine study, the FDA conducted the study in baboons, and an animal model that closely reproduces the way whooping cough affects people. Animals that received an acellular pertussis vaccine and were then inoculated with live Bordetella pertussis strain for a challenge had the bacteria in their airways for up to 6 weeks and were able to spread the infection to unvaccinated animals. And to make it clear, the vaccinated ones, even though they were harboring the infection, they did not show the symptoms. They were asymptomatic, and despite being asymptomatic, they were able to transmit that infection to an naive animal. So, FDA concludes, this research suggests that although individuals immunized with an acellular pertussis vaccine may be protected from disease, they may still become infected with the bacteria without always getting sick and are able to spread infection to others, including young infants who are susceptible to pertussis disease and actually to pertussis complications. So again, are we vaccinating ourselves for pertussis to protect infants? No. Let's go to question 3. And I would like you to guess the answer. Can mass vaccination against a single serotype of bacteria result in serotype replacement? Yes. Who said yes? Yes, and if you're going to say yes to any of these questions, at least once, this will be the time. Okay, so let's look at what bacteria are we talking about here? Anyone wants to guess? Say it out loud. Starts with H.
HPV.
HIV. HIV. All right. So we are talking about Haemophilus influenza. Has nothing to do with influenza the virus. This is bacterium, and the reason it got this name is in the past when people were getting the pneumonia right after the flu, they would be usually, this bacteria would be present in their respiratory system, so it was confused. It was thought that the flu was caused by Haemophilus influenza, so that's how the name was derived. But more recently, or I guess maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we are thinking of Haemophilus influenza and Hib in particular as causing meningitis in children. So what is the difference between Hib and Haemophilus influenza in general? In general, there are more than 6 serotypes of Haemophilus influenza, A, B, C, D, E, F, and non-serotype O. And so what are serotypes? Serotypes are subgroups within the same species of bacteria that are recognized differently by the immune system. Haemophilus is a kind of bacteria that has a polysaccharide capsule around its cell membrane. And so these different types have a different type of polysaccharide capsule. So it's the same organism that wears a different mask. And so the immune system doesn't recognize them as the same thing. It recognizes them as completely different things immunologically. And in the past, Hib type B predominated. So if someone would get invasive disease from Haemophilus influenza, more likely than not, 95% of the time, it would be Hib, and others were less prevalent. Now it changed. People see why. So vaccine was developed for type B only, and this is what was introduced in the 90s. There were no vaccines for other types. And actually, because vaccine is made against the polysaccharide capsule, Theoretically, you can make vaccine for type A, B, C, D, E, F, following the same strategy as for type B, but for NST, you cannot follow the same strategy, or it's unlikely that we would ever have a vaccine for NST, or it has to be a very different design from a Hib vaccine. So let's see what happened after Hib vaccine was introduced. These data are from Public Health Agency of Canada website. And they have this database that you can go in and in real time select which diseases you want to look at, and they will plot a graph for you. So this is what I did a few days ago to get this most up-to-date graph for Hib and for Haemophilus influenza non-B, all the other strains. And so what you see here is that although Hib trend goes down from the 90s down to 1995 and stays down all the way to present time, something started happening in that in Canada, all of a sudden they started discovering in hospitals that people, whenever people get hospitalized with invasive disease from Haemophilus influenza, it would be the other type or one of the other types. And prior to 2007, the other types were not even reportable to Public Health Canada. So they only started doing it in 2007 because it became a need. And now you see how, where we are with non-B types, we are much higher than where we started with type B from pre-vaccine era. Now, what about the virulence of these strains? Are these non-B strains milder? Are they causing less severe disease? Is it okay that we switched from type B to other ones? Not necessarily. So we had a study from 2007 in Canada, and this is what they say. For patients with Hib and Haemophilus A infection, meningitis was the most common presentation, accounting for 40% and 52% respectively, whereas the most common presentation for non-typable serotypes was pneumonia, seen in 43% of cases. And most importantly, mean duration of hospitalization, need for admission to a pediatric intensive care unit, and case fatality rates were similar for the cases because of Hib, Haemophilus A, Haemophilus F, and non-typable serotypes. And actually, non-typable serotypes are usually the most predominant ones. So here we have it. We switched from one problem to another. We didn't solve mortality problem. So how does it look right now, vaccinating for Hib? Does it protect your kids and other kids from invasive disease by Haemophilus influenza? No. And by the way, if you look on the CDC, they do not have such a great tool that you can plot the data right away. They have it in the form of PDFs for each year. But if you look carefully and compare tables for each year, you will see exactly the same trend, with Hib going down, other types going up. So I guess Haemophilus influenza doesn't need a passport to travel between the borders. Let's go to the next question. Can inactivated viral vaccines stop viral transmission? So let's first determine which vaccines are inactivated viral vaccines that we are using now. Something we use every season, and another one that we use only in childhood because we are afraid of what? Yes, IPV. So let's start with polio and IPV. The first thing to distinguish is that poliovirus infection is not equivalent of poliomyelitis. Poliomyelitis is a paralytic disease. Poliovirus infection is you have poliovirus in your body. And how many of you have read IPOL insert? IPOL is one of the vaccine formulations for poliovirus. And there they mention what percent of polioviral infections lead to paralytic polio? 0.1%. Okay, according to IPOL insert, which quotes some medical literature. So that means that 99.9% of polioviral infections historically wasn't leading to paralytic polio. Okay. So then there was OPV vaccine that was introduced in our country that wiped out wild poliovirus. We still have some wild poliovirus in very few countries out there. Now we switch to IPV, inactivated polio vaccine. And the difference between OPV and IPV is that OPV was given orally, so it was creating mucosal immunity, it was creating antibodies in mucosal secretions, whereas IPV is administered intramuscularly, and it is not capable of generating those IgA antibodies in mucosal secretions. So if it doesn't generate antibodies in mucosal secretions, can it prevent colonization by any live poliovirus? There was a study done in Cuba, where in Cuba they had an national OPV campaign, and before that they wanted to see if IPV, how does IPV work. So they got a trial, or children were randomized to receive either IPV or placebo. And after some time, when OPV campaign started, they were also given OPV orally. So they were challenged with live attenuated OPV strains. And so what was observed is that it didn't matter whether they were placebo group or IPV group, OPV strains still got hold of their gut, right? And they were shedding that OPV strains in their stool, regardless of whether they did or did not receive IPV. Now the question is, if IPV could not stop colonization and shedding by OPV, can it do that for wild virus, which is much more intensely replicative virus, which is a stronger, more virulent virus? I think it's unlikely. I think logic would say that if it couldn't hold OPV, it would not hold wild virus. Now, so more recently, we got a confirmation of that from WHO. So what they say, you know how in other countries, they're not switching to IPV. Where you have wild poliovirus, they still keep using OPV. And this is the reason why. IPV is less effective than OPV in inducing intestinal mucosal immunity. I think it's a politically correct way of saying not effective. And the differences may be illustrated by the persistent circulation of wild poliovirus in Israel in 2014. And so to give you a little bit history of that, in Israel they first used OPV to eradicate wild polio, and then they switched to IPV. And wild polio was reintroduced from neighboring countries. And now they got wild poliovirus circulating again. Not that anyone got paralysis, but wild poliovirus is detected in circulation there. So suggesting that wild poliovirus transmission can be sustained for months if undetected in areas with high IPV coverage, where local factors facilitate transmission. So now the question is, we don't have wild poliovirus here for how many decades? Maybe 3 decades or maybe more. Is it because of IPV, or is it because we don't have local factors that facilitate transmission? Maybe we have good sewer system. Okay, and if IPV didn't work for Israel in terms of preventing circulation of reintroduced wild poliovirus, how can we expect it to work here? So, are we vaccinating ourselves and our children with IPV to protect someone else? No. Okay, our favorite, flu shots. So flu shots are designed very similarly to IPV in that it's a whole virus that has been inactivated with formaldehyde and injected into your muscle. And this way of injecting the flu virus does not generate mucosal immunity, so we don't have IgA antibodies and mucosal secretions from this vaccine. And for this reason, this strategy makes it unsuitable for attempting to prevent the transmission of influenza virus. And yet this is being pushed on healthcare workers under pretext of protecting their patients. So if it theoretically cannot work, do we have confirmation from epidemiologic studies that it doesn't work? Yes, we do have confirmation. So we have This from Cochrane database of systematic reviews, which was done in 2016. And this is a very respectable collaboration in Europe that looks at efficacies and safety of various medical interventions. So what they're saying, offering influenza vaccination to healthcare workers based in long-term care homes may have little or no effect on the number of residents, meaning the patients, who develop laboratory-proven influenza compared with those living in care homes where no vaccination is offered. And relative difference is 0. So big fat 0, whether healthcare workers are offered vaccines or not. Something is stuck here. Okay. So let's go to the last question, and this one is the most intriguing. So we know that all these toxoid vaccines and inactivated viral vaccines, they have problems. But those life-attenuated viral vaccines, you know, the MMR, the varicella, they are the best, right? They are the golden standard. They are supposed to create herd immunity. So let's look, did live-attenuated viral vaccines live up to the promise of preventing disease outbreaks in highly vaccinated communities? Have you heard of the measles paradox?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So, but let's start with rubella this time. So, as you know, rubella is a very mild disease for children. It's nothing to worry about for children. However, the only time when rubella is dangerous is if it happens during pregnancy, especially during first trimester. So that's why pregnant women need to be shielded from rubella. In 1973, a community in Wyoming decided to do just that. They decided to vaccinate their preschoolers and kindergartners with the rubella vaccine for the sake of creating community immunity in order to protect pregnant women. And 9 months, interestingly, 9 months after that vaccination campaign, they got an outbreak of rubella. Huge outbreak, 1,000 people were affected, including some pregnant women. The recently vaccinated preschoolers were least affected. They were the ones protected by their vaccine, but that did not protect the community. Okay? So the authors of this paper conclude the concept that a highly immune group of prepubertal children will prevent the spread of rubella in the rest of the community was shown by this epidemic not always to be valid. And I love how they select their words. Not always. Let's go to mumps. So we have mumps disaster in this state and across the country. We have large nationwide outbreaks of mumps in communities like it was here in Washington State, and also very frequently on college campuses. And strikingly, this happens in communities and in recipients of 2-dose vaccination schedule. So, what could be the reasons for this happening? First of all, there is a lawsuit alleging that mumps portion of MMR, the efficacy of that was falsified, and it wasn't 95% as it was advertised for the purposes of licensing. So likely this efficacy is much lower to start with. But on top of that, there is also a problem with waning vaccine immunity. So as it might be working for 9 months or for a year really well after vaccination, and then it starts waning at different rates in different people. And the additional evidence for that theoretic concept, comes from this recent paper where they say vaccine effectiveness of 2 doses versus no doses was lower among students with more distant receipt of the second vaccine dose. Okay? So the further away you go from your childhood 2-dose schedule, the more likely you are to be susceptible to mumps again. And so what is the solution that comes from the CDC? Well, they are introducing or recommending the third dose during outbreak. Okay? So you can be fully vaccinated with your 2 doses, and if there is an outbreak, it is recommended that you go and get your 3rd dose because those 2 doses are not enough. So if 2 doses are not enough to protect you, is it enough to protect someone else? Okay.
So technically, half of us are probably able to get any of this.
The question is, technically we can all get mumps, is that the question?
Yeah.
Sure, as an adult, yeah. And why do 2 doses and then the 3rd one? Can we just do the 3rd one and skip the first 2? And just do the 3rd one when there is outbreak?
And Tetyana, is there even a separate mumps vaccine?
There isn't, so it's a mumps containing vaccine, and which one is it? Okay, so now let's discuss measles. So first, we need to distinguish 2 forms of measles: clinical measles and modified measles. Clinical measles is our typical measles with rash that any doctor in pre-vaccine era could recognize really easily. Modified measles is a rather new phenomenon because it's happening only in vaccinated. So, and it's because of the intermediate level of titers that are left from the vaccine. So what are the titers that result in protection from modified measles versus clinical measles? There was an outbreak of measles in 1990 in Boston University, which allowed researchers to distinguish between the titers and which titers are protective. So, as you know, in Massachusetts, universities require MMR for attendance, so this campus was highly vaccinated. Despite that, when measles outbreak came, there were a few students, actually about 8 of them, who developed full-blown clinical measles despite their prior vaccination. And when they were tested for disease titers, they had below 120 units of neutralizing titers. There were a whole bunch of other students who also developed disease, which didn't look like typical measles. It looked like they had runny nose, cough, fever, headache, photophobia, and even diarrhea. And photophobia is when your eyes are hurting from light. But they didn't have rash. And so these are modified measles cases. They had serological evidence of infection despite not showing rash. And what they found serologically is that pre-exposure measles titers from their vaccine at the time when they were exposed were somewhere between 120 units but below 1,000. And I just want you to remember these numbers, 120 and 1,000, for the purposes of the next slide. Okay, so this was a separate study done in 2007 looking at titer levels of anti-measles antibodies, neutralizing antibodies after the receipt of the second MMR vaccine. So what is shown here is that this receipt is when children are 5 years of age, and this is their second MMR. And so this is a booster. This is not their first one because the study missed them. They're not following them from year 1. So you see where the 1,000 unit titer is. It's over here. And these 4 lines, these are quartiles of this whole group of children of about 600 children involved in the study. 2 years from their second MMR vaccine, we have 50%, 2 quartiles, already fall below 1,000 units. And by the time they are in high school, 75% fall below 1,000 units. So that means that all these children, they are susceptible to modified measles if measles is introduced in their classroom. They are vaccinated, but they will not develop rash, besides those who do have a breakthrough disease, besides those who fall below 120 units. But they have runny nose, they have cough, they have diarrhea. Don't you think that they might be able to transmit that virus in their secretions? And how is it for immunocompromised Johnny to be in the classroom with all these children who are susceptible to modified measles, even if modified measles is not a severe disease for them, how is it for the immunocompromised Johnny to be in the classroom with them? All right. So last but not least is chickenpox. And instead of telling you about chickenpox, I want you to hear it from someone who devoted a lot of years of his career to this, and that's Gary Goldman. So please go to the page of Physicians for Informed Consent and look up his video. He gave this lecture. This was keynote. He was a keynote speaker at the PAC inaugural meeting last year. And it's a mind-boggling lecture. You will learn a lot from that. And please support Physicians for Informed Consent. So now let's do a quiz. Let's see which one of your vaccines help protect everyone else. Did someone's tetanus shot help protect anyone else?
No.
No. How about flu shot? Your flu shot didn't help protect anyone else. Okay. IPV?
No.
No. Mumps containing vaccine? No. None of the above? Okay. Choice E. All right. So now, what are our recommendations for state vaccine policy? First of all, state authorities claim that they have a compelling interest in preventing the spread of infectious diseases for which there are available vaccines. And they do it by means of mandating those vaccines. And then in some states you have exemptions, in other states you don't, so it's a mess, it's not applied evenly. You're right to avoid those mandates. And yet, vaccination mandates for school children and healthcare workers are not defensible by up-to-date scientific understanding of how vaccines work. So, state vaccine policy must be updated to be in line with current science, which justifies informed consent and personal choice in vaccination, rather than state mandates or any other types of coercion practices. Thank you. Do you have time for questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering, like for the inactivated vaccines, polio and the flu, from what you're saying, so does that mean that people who have been vaccinated can also become asymptomatic carriers and give it to other people, or?
For a transient time, they can. So even if, for example, you have the flu, which matches the strain, because most of the time it doesn't, so you still have the full-blown flu. But even if it matches, you yourself don't have the symptoms, but you still get colonized with the virus in your throat.
Mm-hmm.
So
You just might not be sneezing or coughing as much.
yeah, or you might have something milder, like common cold looking thing. So they did some experiments with mice where they experimented with IgA antibodies versus IgG antibodies for the flu for the flu virus, and they found that you need IgA to protect from colonization in the throat, while IgG were protecting lung, lower respiratory tract, because that's where circulation blood comes from. So theoretically, it would protect you if the strain matches, which, as you know, doesn't.
Just in the same vein too, I was wondering with regard to the measles study you were talking about, the people who got the non-rash symptoms, would they also hypothetically be able to transmit it to other people?
Hypothetically, yes. And I think even the state of Washington Public Health is concerned about it, because they were trying to do the study on that, but they could only locate 2 patients with modified measles, and that's because nobody goes to the doctor with common cold-like symptoms or diarrhea, maybe they think it's a stomach bug, and ask to be screened for measles virus. Nobody does it, so it's very difficult to even pinpoint who has modified measles, and it's not a notifiable disease.
If you have modified measles, would you then be immune for life to both types of measles? Or would you possibly
so-
get infected again later and have a rash? Like have
So in those students who had modified measles, their titers went really high after they went through this viral infection, into the range where theoretically they would be protected just like if they had full-blown measles.
Also, I've had a lot, you can get a rash, like, and full-on measles from getting the vaccine, correct? Because I've come across that quite a few times.
Yes, you can. Actually, there is a paper that 1/6, the fraction, like 1/6 of children who get MMR, they come down with rash, fever, and flu-like illness after MMR. So it's quite frequent. It's just called viral rash or vaccine adverse event of unknown.
It's just a virus, it's
Yes.
Thursday. But are we supposed to be terrified of viruses?
Well, as long as rash is from vaccine, it's okay, but if it's from the viral virus, it's not okay.
I just wanted to follow up on this other gentleman's question about this idea about asymptomatic carriers. I mean, you mentioned in regards to pertussis and wild polio virus and some other examples. Given that that seems to be the picture with this idea of mandated group or herd immunity, is that being studied actively in terms of how that affects transmission rates of these diseases?
So with pertussis, they started studying it since 2014 or so, and that's because reality forces them to study pertussis coming back despite high rates of vaccination. So I think that forced them to look into it. With IPV, they're not going to study it because there is no wild polio virus here, so why waste resources for that? But if it was going to be introduced due to local factors that facilitate transmission, they would have to study it. But they already know.
So for herd immunity and vaccines not being effective, is the other side of the coin that vaccines are also not effective for self-immunity?
For personal immunity.
That may be another PowerPoint, but if I wanted to take it another direction, would you say that there's another side of the coin, that even from a self-immunity standpoint, vaccines do not help?
So the way they were advertised in the beginning is that they give long life immunity, just one shot. We even had these posters from the 60s, protect your child from measles with just one shot. And at that time, I think the level of knowledge was that that should work. I think they were making some reasonable assumptions, but it didn't turn out to be the case. And what we have now, it's quite clear that vaccine immunity is short-lasting. It runs out. And how soon it runs out, it depends on several factors, including your personal genetics. So some people are genetically or immunogenetically high responders, some are low responders. It depends on the age at which you receive vaccine, and even some months matter. So it depends if it's 9 months versus 1 year versus 15 months, that matters. So if you're too young, you receive that vaccine, duration of protection is not going to be as long as if you waited a little bit longer. And also there are some gender differences and vitamin A status differences. So it's a mess on how vaccine, how long, you can now predict from all these different factors how long that vaccine will last for you.
And then one more point to that, it's interesting that theoretically a vaccine contains this. I mean, you've explained that in scientific terms. But as a layman, I understand vaccines basically being a host or a carrier for all sorts of toxicity, such as mercury,
So,
which would compromise your immune system, which then puts you in the cycle of more likely to catch a virus, disease, flu, or what have you.
So
it's like
two components that are really bad for the immune system, and I've done another lecture on that, and it's also on the website of Informed Choice Washington, so you can look at the details. But yes, so mercury has ethyl mercury, right? You're talking about thimerosal. It is now known to be an immunosuppressant, okay? And it's very recent, I think 2016, that they did that study. So yeah, so you're injecting that immunosuppressant into your system during the flu season when you really need your immune system, and then people get something that looks like the flu right after they got the flu shot, and they're told that cannot be from the flu shot. Okay? Yeah, but it could be from mercury, ethyl mercury, suppressing your immune system. Yes.
So there's active and passive consequences and dangers about vaccines, not only it being as an ineffective herd immunity tactic, but also self-immunity.
Yes. So it does a lot of damage from all these vaccine ingredients. You know, natural vaccines don't come with aluminum, they don't come with mercury, and there are lots of other components in vaccines which are not even disclosed, such as LPS and the toxin, which also does a lot of harm. So none of that comes to us through natural infections, whereas either contaminants or adjuvants in vaccines.
I had a question, sort of piggybacking on when you were talking about the effectiveness depending on the month given, because I have heard several times or several places online that for infants, they can't even mount a full immune response if they were good responders up until after a year old. Are you familiar? Does that
So this refers to whether infants can or cannot mount immune response.
Yes.
This
And
refers
they're
to
being
live
loaded up.
attenuated vaccines. So basically to childhood diseases, and that's because in the past mothers still had maternal immunity, and with those circulating antibodies, they actually suppress the immune response to incoming virus. And so this is how Mother Nature was protecting infants against any incoming infection of the same kind that the mother was already immune to. And if vaccine happens to be that infection, well, it would block that vaccine from working because the virus wouldn't just be able to replicate.
I know this is a little off from community immunity or whatever, but maybe you know. And so I just want to ask, how solid is the science behind things like measles, training your immune system to fight off something more serious like cancer? Because I think there have been some studies that have shown that they've taken the measles virus and tweaked it and used it to fight off cancer. Is that solid science? Is that still very speculation?
Yeah, so there is some research on comparing history of measles versus no history of measles on the rates of cancer such as leukemia, Hodgkin's lymphoma. History of measles correlates with reduced risk of those diseases later on. Obviously, this cannot be done as randomized placebo-controlled trial because you cannot infect someone with measles versus not. So it has to be in a study with cohorts. So that's how far we can go to say that. Also, measles, history of measles correlates with less of atopy, and atopy being asthma, allergy type of diseases.
I remember reading in Dr. Suzanne's book that it is possible to not have any antibodies to measles, but actually be immune. Is that true? And also, my sister had wild measles as a child, and then when she went to college later in life, she kept having no antibodies, even though she had the wild.
So with respect to the first question, I think maybe what was meant is that you don't have antibodies or ability to make antibodies, such as patients with a gamma globulinemia, and you can still go through measles with rash and everything else and survive. So their rates of complications and death from measles were not different from healthy children. So I think maybe that's what was meant. If you can't make antibodies for immunogenetic reasons, you can still deal with measles just fine. And second question?
Oh, I'm just wondering, because like I said, my sister had wild measles, and then later in life, she was tested her antibodies, and she kept showing up as if she never had them. So.
Maybe something wrong with the test. Do you have more time, or is it time to?
Yeah. If there are a few more questions, we could probably go a few more minutes on this.
Okay.
I have a question. So you showed us that I think 75% of people no longer have antibodies to measles by the time they're, young adults.
So they still have, but under 1,000 units.
Right.
So they puts them in this.
So why, in that that's the case, that most people under age 50 were vaccinated against measles and they presumably have pretty low titers today, why don't we see more outbreaks of measles than we do? Is it because they're having modified needles and they think it's the cold? Is it because it's not so much the circulation? Why don't we see more?
Yeah, possibly that the majority, the bulk of measles is modified and so it doesn't show up when an outbreak does come. And also, you know how aggressive they are now about hunting down the cases, isolating the cases. This wasn't done in the 60s.
Yeah.
People could just have their measles and nobody would pay attention to that. Now, there was one very peculiar outbreak that happened in Canada, in Quebec. That was a province with very high vaccination rate. And their public health decided that, well, they're well under protection of herd immunity, therefore they don't need to do quarantine or isolation or do any other draconian measures. And what happened without those draconian measures is that that outbreak that involved, started with a vaccinated high school teacher, involved first high school and then the whole community of more than 600 individuals. The measles cases among doubly vaccinated were underreported. So that outbreak was probably much higher than what the official statistics was. So it was a big, big anomaly, but that's only because herd immunity doesn't work and they didn't do any other measures.
Yeah, I was, the implication of what you're saying is that vaccination can actually make outbreaks worse. And then it turns into a vicious cycle where the outbreak itself creates this fervor for vaccinating people more, which is going to just make future outbreaks even worse again. Kind of a vicious cycle. And I'm just kind of wondering if you have some ideas about how to break out of that cycle.
Well, first of all, we have to lose our fear of disease, understand what creates complications from disease, why one person has measles and recovers without any problem and another person has complications. And that is part of the knowledge that's within our reach. We understand the immune system enough to know how to handle that. And again, I described a lot of that in a previous lecture last year that you can find on the website. So we can start from there. And then there are additional tools such as immunoglobulin for immunocompromised and something which very few people heard about, and I myself haven't heard about it until recently, transfer factor. It was used for chickenpox in the UK to prevent cancer patients or children who have leukemia from if they're exposed to chickenpox. It really ameliorated the disease greatly, so they didn't have a problem from chickenpox, which they would otherwise have in their state. So we could develop tools and understanding of nutrition and not be afraid of these outbreaks, even if they come back.
I tried to expose my kids like 3 different times to chickenpox in various neighborhood kids, and it never took.
That means that chickenpox is not infectious, right?
No idea. We tried everything. But what about the wild versus if somebody's vaccinated for chickenpox or shingles vaccine?
So I would really suggest that you watch that lecture, and it may answer all of your questions. Just briefly, when children are vaccinated with the strain from the vaccine, 5% of the time they do develop lesions. And the virus that is found in that lesions is a kind of mutant virus that is between the wild and the vaccine virus. So now we could have a whole bunch of different chickenpox viruses around, and we don't know how that messes up immunity. And I heard from nurses that they have chickenpox 3 times in a row within a few months. And I asked, well, was it chickenpox and then shingles? And she said, no, it was chickenpox. So something really strange is going on, and it's probably we have such a mess with different chickenpox strains that we just headed towards disaster, in addition to shingles.
I just wanted to add a possibly helpful comment on that is you can catch it from shingles. All my kids caught it from my wife's had a small case of shingles. Yeah.
So maybe, maybe that's the way to go now. Shingles parties.
I can talk to you more later because I have some other experiences that I think might be helpful.
And
lecture, I'm excited to watch that. And you may address that in that one, but if your child was exposed to someone who was shedding from the vaccine, from the varicella, if they developed chickenpox from that, would they have immunity to wild, or we don't really know?
And especially now that people say they have chickenpox several times in a very short time, it's really strict.
Because we exposed my son to what we think was wild, and he shared lollipops, he shared t-shirt, and I watched him like right at 21 days, and he got lethargic, he had tummy upset, and he had one spot on his neck. So we haven't had his titers checked yet, but we hope that it took.
Maybe last question and then a break.
I was just curious, as to your opinion, do you think it's theoretically possible that all of these diseases, we could have gotten rid of them a long time ago, but we're keeping them around just because we're constantly, basically reintroducing this? Because kind of like what he said, we're constantly in this vicious cycle of introducing something that's kind of modified, and then that can actually spread to other people in both forms, in both the modified form and the wild form. So you're kind of, especially because we don't really know which one it is.
There are certainly some diseases that could have gone, such as tetanus. Those are not childhood diseases, and they're not contagious, and it's just a matter of wound hygiene and other things that we can discuss at VBCH. Whether measles would go away, probably not. It would probably be more manageable, less complicated. We had mortality of about 400 individuals were dying from measles every year in the 60s, about 100 from chickenpox, so that could have been brought down even more. So diseases would be still around, but they would be much milder if we paid attention to what the immune system needs. And they're always cyclical, so measles would always be every 3 years in the community, and that's because every time you have an outbreak, it would convert non-immunes into immunes, establishes herd immunity temporarily. Then, the older generation dies, babies are born, so that proportion is switched again or changed again, and you have another outbreak. Okay, let's have a break now, and we will have more questions together with Marian.